There is one name that made Hitler nervous. Not Churchill, not Stalin, not Eisenhower. A German general, a man who served under Hitler's own flag, and still managed to terrify him. What this man did on the battlefield, how he lived, what he refused to do, and how it all ended, is one of the most extraordinary stories to come out of the Second World War. This is the story of Erwin Rommel. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim, a quiet town in the Kingdom of Württemberg in southwestern Germany. His father was a school teacher, his mother the daughter of a local government official. Nothing about his upbringing suggested that he would one day become the most celebrated and most feared military commander of his era. As a child, Rommel was frail and pale. He was quiet, studious, and showed no early signs of the physical fearlessness that would define his adult life. His father wanted him to become an engineer. Rommel, however, had other ideas. At 18, he applied to join the Imperial German Army and was accepted as an officer cadet. From the moment he entered military service, something shifted. The shy boy from Heidenheim disappeared. What replaced him was a soldier who seemed almost incapable of hesitation. He trained at the Royal War Academy in Danzig and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in January 1912, assigned to the 124th Infantry Regiment in Weingarten. Within months, it was clear to those around him that Rommel was not an ordinary officer. He had an instinct for terrain, for timing, for reading the battlefield in a way that most men spent entire careers trying to learn and never quite managed. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Rommel was 22 years old. He went to France with his regiment and fought in the opening months of the war. In one of his earliest engagements, he led a small patrol against a much larger French unit and attacked. Not because he was ordered to, because he judged it was the right moment. That decision earned him the Iron Cross Second Class. It would not be the last decoration he received, and it would not be the last time he made decisions that others considered reckless, but that he considered simply logical. By 1915, Rommel had been transferred to the Württemberg Mountain Battalion and was fighting in the Vosges Mountains and later in Romania. In 1917, at the Battle of Caporetto on the Italian front, he pulled off one of the most stunning infantry maneuvers of the entire war. Leading a small detachment of around 600 men, he captured Monte Marajour and took nearly 10,000 Italian prisoners in under 2 days. The German High Command awarded him the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military honor, known informally as the Blue Max. He was 25 years old. What was already becoming apparent, and what would define his reputation for the next 3 decades, was a specific philosophy of war. Rommel believed in speed, surprise, and presence at the point of decision. He did not direct battles from the rear. He moved to the front, assessed with his own eyes, and acted before the enemy could react. He called it Fingerspitzengefühl, a German term meaning fingertip feeling, the ability to sense what was happening across a battlefield and respond instinctively, faster than the enemy could process what was occurring. It was a gift that could not be taught, and it was about to be tested on a scale far beyond anything the First World War had offered. Coming up, Rommel finds his stage, and it is unlike anything the world had seen before. The years between the wars were quiet for Rommel. He married Lucy Maria Mollin in 1916, and they had one son, Manfred, born in 1928. He served as an instructor at the infantry school in Dresden, and later at the War Academy in Potsdam. In 1937, he published a book drawn from his battlefield notes, Infanteriegreift an, or Infantry Attacks, a detailed study of the tactical lessons he had drawn from the First World War. The book became a sensation in German military circles and was read by officers across Europe. Among its readers was Adolf Hitler, who requested a meeting with its author. Rommel fit Hitler's image of bold military action precisely, and was appointed commander of his personal headquarters guard, the Führerbegleitkommando, during the campaigns in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Rommel found the ceremonial role suffocating. He requested a combat command. Hitler gave him one. In February 1940, Rommel was appointed commander of the 7th Panzer Division, despite having no prior experience commanding armored forces. What followed over the next 2 months would rewrite the textbook on mechanized warfare. When Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries on May 10, 1940, the 7th Panzer Division under Rommel moved so fast that the French army, and even German high command, struggled to track its position. In one celebrated instance, Rommel's division advanced so far ahead of its supply lines and flanking units that it was temporarily reported as destroyed by German intelligence. It was not destroyed. It was simply ahead of everyone else. The 7th Panzer Division captured 25 French generals and nearly 100,000 prisoners. Rommel himself was almost killed several times, including when his command tank was struck by a shell during the crossing of the Somme River. He continued the advance the same day. By the time France fell in June 1940, the 7th Panzer Division had earned a nickname, the Ghost Division, because no one could locate it until it had already arrived. Then came North Africa. In early 1941, Germany's Italian allies were collapsing in Libya under British pressure. Hitler sent Rommel to Africa as commander of the newly formed Deutsches Afrika Korps, the German Africa Corps, with orders to stabilize the front. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941. He was given strict instructions not to launch any major offensive until his forces were fully assembled and supplied, which would take weeks. He ignored those instructions within 48 hours. By March 31st, barely 6 weeks after landing, Rommel had launched a full offensive and was driving the British back across Libya. Within 2 weeks, he had retaken almost all the ground the Italians had lost over months of fighting. The British commander, General Richard O'Connor, was captured. The entire strategic situation in North Africa had flipped. London was stunned. Churchill demanded to know who this general was. The answer that came back described a man who moved at night, who appeared where he was least expected, who changed direction mid-battle based on what he personally observed at the front. The British press gave him a name, the Desert Fox. The name stuck because it was accurate. In the vast open terrain of the North African desert, Rommel had found the perfect environment for his style of warfare: speed, deception, and decisions made faster than the enemy could counter them. Over the following 18 months, Rommel and the British 8th Army fought back and forth across the western desert of Libya and Egypt in a campaign that produced some of the most dramatic reversals of military fortune in modern history. At one point, his forces were just 60 miles from Alexandria. Churchill reportedly told the House of Commons that Rommel was, despite their being enemies, a great general, a comment that caused embarrassment in the War Office. In June 1942, Rommel captured Tobruk, a fortified port the British had held for 8 months. Over 30,000 prisoners were taken. Hitler promoted him to field marshal on the spot. At 50 years old, Rommel was the youngest field marshal in the history of the German army. What happened next, and why it began to crack, is where the story becomes far darker. By the summer of 1942, Rommel had achieved something remarkable. He had built a reputation that transcended the war itself. He was admired by his enemies, celebrated by his own side, and discussed in every military headquarters from London to Washington to Moscow. His name had become a kind of shorthand for a certain type of military brilliance, the ability to improvise, to act, to win against the odds. But the odds were changing. The problem was not Rommel. The problem was the logic of the war itself. North Africa was always, for Germany, a secondary theater. Hitler's focus was the Eastern Front, where millions of men were grinding each other to pieces across a front line, stretching nearly 2,000 miles. The supplies and reinforcements that Rommel needed, more tanks, more fuel, more infantry, were being consumed in Russia at a rate that left little for the desert. Rommel knew this. He sent repeated requests to Berlin for additional resources. He was told the situation would improve. It did not. At the same time, British intelligence was reading German communications at a level that Rommel did not know about. The British had broken German military codes through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park. Every message Rommel sent to Berlin, every supply convoy he ordered, every planned movement he communicated through standard channels, the British were reading it before his own commanders received it. Ships carrying fuel and ammunition to the Afrika Korps were being sunk in the Mediterranean at alarming rates. Rommel's forces were often fighting on rations that were a fraction of what they needed. Tank crews were cannibalizing disabled vehicles to keep others running. Fuel shortages halted advances that could have been decisive. In the summer of 1942, a new British commander arrived in North Africa, General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was meticulous, careful, and extremely well supplied. He refused to attack until he was ready. He built up a massive numerical superiority in tanks, men, and aircraft. When he moved, it was with overwhelming force. On October 23, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began. Rommel was not even in Africa when it started. He had been in Germany recovering from illness. He flew back the moment he learned of the attack. But by the time he arrived, the situation was already deteriorating. For 12 days, Montgomery's forces hammered the Afrika Korps. The British had roughly 2,000 tanks. Rommel had barely 300 operational. His fuel reserves were dangerously low. British air power dominated the skies. There was no room for Fingerspitzengefühl when you were simply outgunned. On November 4, 1942, Rommel ordered a retreat. Hitler sent an immediate order: stand fast, yield not a step. Rommel read the order, paused, and then continued the retreat anyway. He knew that to stand fast was to be destroyed. He chose to save what remained of his army. It was one of the first direct acts of defiance toward Hitler in Rommel's career. It would not be the last. Over the following months, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria to the west, Operation Torch, while Montgomery pushed from the east. Rommel's command was squeezed from both sides. In March 1943, Rommel was recalled to Germany, ostensibly for medical treatment. He never returned to Africa. By May 1943, the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. Nearly 250,000 men went into Allied captivity. North Africa was over, but Rommel was not finished. What came next would cost him everything. Rommel returned to active command in late 1943, assigned to inspect the Atlantic Wall, the vast system of fortifications Germany had constructed along the coast of Western Europe from Norway to the Spanish border. Hitler believed it was an impenetrable barrier. Rommel did not. What Rommel found during his inspections disturbed him deeply. The Atlantic Wall was, in many places, a myth. The fortifications were incomplete, poorly positioned, and insufficient to stop a determined Allied amphibious assault. The beaches were inadequately mined, the obstacles were too sparse, the reserve forces were positioned too far inland to respond quickly. In January 1944, Rommel was given command of Army Group B, responsible for the defense of France and the Low Countries, the most likely zone of an Allied invasion. He immediately set about transforming what he found. He drove his engineers and soldiers relentlessly. Millions of mines were laid on the beaches and in the fields behind them. Thousands of obstacles, steel and concrete stakes, angled poles, wire entanglements, were placed in the surf zones. Inland fields were flooded or studded with poles to prevent glider landings. Artillery positions were improved and camouflaged. But Rommel also disagreed fundamentally with German strategic doctrine for how to handle the invasion when it came. The prevailing German view, held by commanders like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and supported by the armored warfare theorist Heinz Guderian, was that the key reserve, the armored panzer divisions, should be held back from the coast and deployed in a massive counterattack once the Allied landing zone was identified. Rommel believed this was a fatal mistake. Air power, he argued, had changed everything. In North Africa, he had watched Allied aircraft systematically destroy his ability to move in daylight. In France in 1944, Allied air superiority would be even more overwhelming. A reserve held back from the coast would be bombed, strafed, and delayed before it ever reached the battle. The only way to stop the invasion, Rommel argued, was to defeat it on the beaches in the first 24 hours. He repeatedly pressed for the armored reserves to be positioned near the coast, under his direct command. Hitler refused to commit. The panzer divisions were kept under central control, and their deployment would require Hitler's personal authorization. It was an argument about military doctrine that had enormous consequences. When the Allied invasion came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, Rommel was in Germany, visiting his wife on her birthday. He had judged, based on weather reports, that an invasion was unlikely in the next few days. He was wrong. By the time he received word of the landings and drove back to France, the Allies were already ashore. When he requested the release of the armored reserves to counterattack, the request wound its way through the chain of command. Hitler was asleep, and had left orders not to be disturbed. The authorization was delayed for hours. Those hours may have decided the outcome of the invasion. In the days that followed, Allied forces expanded their beachhead. German armored counterattacks were shredded by Allied air power before they could close with the enemy. The doctrine Rommel had warned against was playing out exactly as he had predicted. By July 1944, the battle for Normandy was consuming German forces at a rate that could not be sustained. Rommel knew the war in the West was lost. He was not the only senior German officer who believed this, but he was one of the most prominent. And it was in these weeks, in the summer of 1944, that the final and most dangerous chapter of Rommel's life began. By the summer of 1944, a significant number of senior German officers and officials had reached a conclusion that a year earlier would have been unthinkable. The war was lost. Hitler was leading Germany to destruction, and the only path to saving what remained of the country and of Europe was to remove Hitler from power. The conspiracy that had been growing in the shadows of the German military establishment for years was now approaching a point of action. Its participants included high-ranking officers, government officials, and intelligence figures. The man at its center, in terms of operational planning, was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Rommel's precise involvement in the conspiracy remains one of the genuinely contested historical questions of the Second World War. What is established is this: several of the conspiracy's key figures made contact with Rommel in the weeks before July 1944 and sought his support. They knew that if the attempt against Hitler succeeded and a new German government needed legitimacy in the eyes of the German people and the Western Allies, Rommel's name carried weight that almost no other officers did. Rommel did not join the conspiracy as a planner. He was not involved in the operational details. He was deeply skeptical of the assassination plan itself, not out of loyalty to Hitler, but because he believed that killing Hitler would create a martyr and destabilize any post-war settlement. His stated preference was for Hitler to be arrested and put on trial, but he had listened. He had not reported the conversations to the SS or the Gestapo. In the culture of the Third Reich, that alone was enough to make him complicit. On July 17, 1944, 3 days before the assassination attempt, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British aircraft on a road in Normandy. The driver lost control. The car went off the road at high speed. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle and suffered severe head injuries, multiple skull fractures. He was rushed to hospital and was unconscious for days. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg placed a briefcase bomb under a table at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia and left the room. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. A supporting pillar of the map table had partially shielded him from the blast. Within hours, the SS and Gestapo were systematically dismantling the conspiracy and arresting every person connected to it. The interrogations were extensive and brutal. Under torture and extreme pressure, some conspirators revealed names. Rommel's name surfaced in more than one account. Two of the senior conspirators, when pressed, identified Rommel as someone who had been approached and who had not refused. Hitler was informed. For weeks, nothing happened. Rommel was still recovering from his head injuries at his home in Herrlingen in southern Germany. The Nazi leadership debated what to do. A public trial of the most famous general in Germany, a man whose face appeared on propaganda posters, whose name was used to sell war bonds, was unthinkable. It would undermine the entire edifice of military loyalty the regime depended on. The decision made was one of cold, institutional calculation. Rommel would be given a choice. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel, sent directly from Hitler's headquarters. They carried with them a document outlining the accusations against Rommel. They also carried a vial of cyanide. They told Rommel his options. He could face a people's court, a Nazi show tribunal that guaranteed a death sentence and the ruin of his family and those associated with him. His wife and son would face consequences. Members of his staff would be arrested. Or he could take the cyanide. In return, the regime would announce that he had died of his wounds from the July air attack. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His family would be protected and provided for. Rommel said farewell to his wife, Lucy. He told his 15-year-old son, Manfred, what was happening. He then left with the two generals. 15 minutes later, he was dead. The official announcement from Berlin stated that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of the wounds sustained in the July 17th air attack. Hitler ordered a state funeral. He sent a personal wreath. A day of national mourning was declared. The lie held until after the war was over. What sets Rommel apart in the history of the Second World War, and what makes his story so enduring, is not simply his battlefield record. It is something else, something that matters beyond tactics and campaigns. There are well-documented instances throughout the North African campaign of German forces in other theaters receiving orders to execute prisoners, to eliminate civilians considered threats, to carry out the racial policies of the Nazi state. Rommel received some of these orders in North Africa. His response was consistent. He ignored them or refused them outright. When the infamous Kommissarbefehl, the order to execute captured Soviet political officers, was extended in modified form to the African theater, Rommel did not implement it. When orders came relating to the treatment of Jewish soldiers serving with British Commonwealth forces in North Africa, Rommel rejected them. There is no documented case of Rommel's forces in North Africa carrying out the kinds of systematic atrocities that occurred in other German-commanded theaters. His captured British officers were treated according to the laws of war. Medical personnel on both sides were allowed to treat the wounded without interference. Water, scarce and precious in the desert, was shared with captured enemy soldiers. British prisoners taken by the Afrika Korps frequently reported being treated with a decency that surprised them, given the broader context of the war. This was not universally true of Rommel. He operated within the German military system and carried out Hitler's strategic objectives. He was not a resistor from the beginning. He was a professional soldier who served the state he had served his entire career. But the distinction between Rommel and many of his peers is real, and it is documented. His former British opponents wrote about it after the war with a specificity that carries weight. Montgomery himself, during the North African campaign, warned his own troops against letting Rommel's reputation undermine their confidence, an acknowledgement of how seriously the British military took the threat he represented. There is a particular quality to the way Rommel fought that soldiers on both sides recognized at the time and that historians have grappled with since. He was a man who found his fullest expression in war, who was gifted with abilities that war rewarded, and who served a cause he had not fully examined, until perhaps the end. By 1944, the evidence suggests that Rommel had concluded not just that the war was lost, but that the regime prosecuting it was itself a catastrophe. Whether that conclusion came early enough or went far enough is a question that historians have debated for decades and will continue to debate. What is not debated is what it cost him. After the war, the truth of Rommel's death emerged through the accounts of survivors, from his son Manfred, who later became the mayor of Stuttgart and spent decades speaking about his father, from members of Rommel's staff, and from documents that surfaced during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent investigations. The regime's lie, that Rommel had died peacefully of his wounds, collapsed under the weight of testimony. Bergdorf and Mazel had told several people what actually happened. Members of Rommel's household staff knew, his wife knew, his son had been told directly. What followed was a slow, complex reassessment that took place across several decades and continues today. In Germany, Rommel's name was used carefully in the post-war years. The new Federal Republic of Germany, building its own identity and eventually its own military, the Bundeswehr, needed figures from the German military tradition who were not tainted by the worst crimes of the Nazi era. Rommel, with his documented refusal of criminal orders and his connection to the July 20th conspiracy, was one of the names that could be used. Several Bundeswehr installations were named after him. His image appeared in military contexts as an example of soldierly conduct. In Britain, the former officers who had fought against him wrote memoirs and gave interviews in which they consistently acknowledged the quality of the opponent they had faced. General Sir Claude Auchinleck, whose career suffered significantly from Rommel's early successes in Africa, later wrote with genuine respect about the man who had outmaneuvered him. In the United States, Rommel's campaigns were studied at West Point and became part of the curriculum for generations of American officers. The doctrine of mission-type tactics, giving subordinates a clear objective and trusting them to find the method, owes something to the model Rommel represented. In the wider historical literature, the picture has become more nuanced over time. Scholars have examined whether Rommel's clean reputation in North Africa fully accounts for his conduct throughout his career, and harder questions remain about his role in France in 1940 and what he knew of the regime's broader policies. What remains, stripped of myth-making on either side, is a record of unusual complexity for a military man of his era. He was a soldier who consistently sought the front rather than safety. A commander whose troops followed him with a loyalty that his methods alone cannot entirely explain. A man who, in the specific context of the Desert War, conducted himself with a professional honor that his opponents recognized and recorded. A figure who, in the final months of his life, was forced to confront the nature of the regime he had served and found himself unable to survive that confrontation. He was 52 years old when he died in the back seat of a car on a quiet road near his home, in the middle of an afternoon in October. The war he had helped to make extraordinary lasted another 7 months after his death. The story of Erwin Rommel does not fit cleanly into any single frame. He was not a saint, and he was not a simple instrument of evil. He was a man of extraordinary military ability who served a monstrous regime, maintained certain lines he would not cross, and ultimately paid with his life for the knowledge he had accumulated about the people who ran that regime. What history records is a battlefield reputation that outlasted his enemies, a code of conduct that stood apart from the worst of his era, and an end imposed not by his enemies, but by the government he had served for 30 years. The fear Hitler had of Rommel was not the fear of a rival in a conventional sense. It was the fear that a man like Rommel, admired, decorated, credible, and known to have doubts, represented something that could not be controlled by the usual means of terror and loyalty oaths. In the end, it could not be. He was removed quietly on a Tuesday afternoon, with a state funeral promised and a lie prepared in advance. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.